When you hear the term faith-based film, what do you think of? And what films, in your opinion, fit into that category? I mean, are they films just about faith in general? Are they films about specific faiths? And if so, which faiths fit into that category? Are they just specifically Christian films? And if so, do they have to be made by Christian filmmakers? Or more broadly, are they just inspirational films? And if so, what do you consider to be inspiring? There's a lot of confusion surrounding the term faith-based films. We're going to try and unpack some of that today and hopefully clear some of it up as we take a look at that term of faith-based films. Coming up on the other side. Hey there, y'all. Tim Risto here, host of the Creative Christians Podcast, joining you once again for another new episode of Creative Christians AfterThoughts. It is so good to see you. Thanks for joining me today. As most of my regular viewers and listeners know, I am working on a new episode of the Creative Christians audio podcast, all about faith-based films. So I've been trying to watch a lot of films and also do a lot of online research about that specific category of films. But the first thing I discovered when I sat down to type in the Google search field is the quandary of what do I type in? Do I search for Christian films? Do I search for faith-based films? Do I search for inspirational films or some other term completely different? I realized very quickly that a lot of filmmakers, studios, article writers online writing about those things refer to this category of films very differently. Generally, most use the term now faith-based films, but older articles may say Christian films. Newer ones may even say inspirational films. There's a broad spectrum of terms that get used. So I had to kind of backtrack a little bit in my research and figure out what is a Christian film or faith-based film, and how am I going to refer to that in my episode as I'm talking about it, and what's the title of my episode going to be. So I backtracked a bit and started looking at this whole subject a little closer. Found a few articles, still finding some. In fact, today I found one about it that I thought we'd take a look at, maybe start to unpack some of the mystery about what exactly is a Christian film or a faith-based film, and how should we best refer to it. So we're going to head on over to religionunplugged.com and take a look at an article there. This article is called Attempting to Define the Faith-Based Movie Genre. This is by Joseph Holmes, who is writing for Religion Unplugged, and this is from back in January of this year. So, 5-6 months old, but still extremely relevant issue because, I don't think the question about what to label Christian films has really been answered yet. As long as they've been around, so-called faith-based films have been mired in controversy, whether it's accusations of bad writing and acting, heavy-handed messages of the demonizing of non-Christians. Such movies always seem to be a lightning rod of passionate disagreements. One of the most interesting controversies has been its very definition, faith-based films. What is a faith-based film? Is it a movie made by the faith-based film industry? Is it a movie marketed toward Christians? Is it any movie with a redemptive message? Behind what sounds like a simple series of questions is a battle that actually matters, because it's about what kind of movies, and therefore what kinds of representations of faith, various religious communities own as their own, and therefore which faith experiences are validated in the cultural imagination. But to understand this controversy and why it matters, we need to go back to the beginning. Actually, I'm really glad his article goes this way. He's going to go back to the beginning of the Christian film and movie industry. Before I even saw this article today, this was the path I was going down with my own podcast episode, because to a degree, you have to kind of go back to the historical perspective of how things started. Back to 1950s Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, even before that, because faith-based films it really started with the beginning of filmmaking. So there's a lot to explore. You just may not think of some things that way as much because we kind of got trained into a certain way of thinking, especially here in modern times. But faith-based films actually have a very rich history. So he takes a look at that, which is kind of interesting. He goes on to say, for most of American film's history, there was no separation between faith-based and non-faith-based. Hollywood put our secular movies like The Apartment and Star Wars along with religious ones such as The Robe and Ben-Hur. Everyone just called them movies. Oh, how true. As recounted in Tyler Smith's documentary, Real Redemption, Hollywood and the wider American Christian community had a major falling out with the 1988 release of The Last Temptation of Christ, which portrayed a version of Jesus who was sinful. Many of you may remember that film when it came out, if you were around back in the late 80s. It was very controversial because it tried to emphasize more of the human nature of Christ instead of true God, true man. So, been a long time since I've seen any part of that film even, so I don't remember exactly how that portrayal went, but it definitely had some controversial elements to it. It's not a biblical film in that regard. Christians no longer trusted Hollywood to make movies that represented them on their beliefs, so they set out to make their own. These ranged from VeggieTales to The Omega Code and Left Behind, and were mostly sold in Christian bookstores, which were ubiquitous in the 1990s. But they didn't break out until Mel Gibson's 2004 independent film, The Passion of the Christ, broke box office records and established that Christian audiences were a big market. And what a great film that is. Phenomenal film that really did break from all the way back in, like I said, say 1950s, The Ten Commandments. Films like that I watched on TV growing up that were staples of network TV, shown every year. Really nothing had come along that had been quite that groundbreaking until Passion of the Christ, at least as far as biblical epics go. Meanwhile, the Kendrick brothers Facing the Giants and Fireproof proved that low-budget Christian inspirational dramas, there's that term, inspirational film or inspirational drama here, were reliable moneymakers and launched a whole industry based around these, both independently and funded by Hollywood studios, from War Room to God's Not Dead and Miracles from Heaven to The Sound of Freedom, last year's great big faith-based film hit. When people think of faith-based films, they typically are thinking of ones made by the religious movie industry. These are films that are marketed to people who go to movies specifically if the movies affirm their faith in a Christian God. These films are typically made by Christians, either independently or in partnership with Hollywood studios like Lionsgate or Sony, but can also be made specifically by Hollywood studios to tap into the market. Given that these are the movies that were born out of wishing to be an alternative to Hollywood's secular filmmaking, this definition makes sense. Because the majority of Christians within the faith market happen to be church-going moms, films in this genre tend to prioritize the tastes and values of that demographic. This means that the movies have hallmark, feel-good, family-friendly, inspirational dramas that focus on life-affirming lessons and affirmations of faith. And I guess this is one of the bigger issues that I have, is a lot of films do tend to be that in the faith-based film category and are marketed towards the moms and the female audience, which is all fine and good, but it leaves out a big part of the audience, your male audience, and and of course, there's a lot that are directed towards children as well. There's a lot of animated things and sometimes some teen dramas and things like that. But the male audience oftentimes is largely left out of being marketed to. That is something that I think Sound of Freedom last year addressed relatively well. Although you can make an argument that was aimed at a much larger audience than just men, but certainly it helped to capture, I think, a good part of the male audience as well. So that is a big shift, I think, in terms of the marketing of faith-based films. But that's a whole other discussion, of course. But that does kind of play into what's been talked about here. The problem with defining faith-based films based on this one audience's tastes and preferences is that it's far too narrow to represent the varieties of faith experiences or even how God himself works in the world. And again, this is part of my whole point too. But that it becomes a very narrow audience. And I don't want to get too far afield here on things, but certainly looking back here, what we were just talking about, the history of films, the track record of films over time plays into how it's going to be named and categorized. The audience of the films, who not only who it's marketed towards, but also how that audience responds to the film is going to play into, how they're going to name and categorize these films. So that's all been part of it historically. Okay, he kind of goes off on a tangent here, and I don't want to get into all this. I mean, he brings up his podcast and people that he talked to on there. But if we come back and punch in here after he mentions talking with these people on his podcast, different filmmakers and the like, he says, and all of them agree that they don't feel represented by films made by the faith-based film industry. A common complaint is that the movies don't include space for darker or more nuanced material that includes more of the dark parts of human experience, that the faith-based film industry doesn't show because it wants to be family-friendly. And again, this is really where I think Sound of Freedom last year made a break from that. It got into some dark territory, had a lot of male characters in it, and it emphasized some aspects of real-world life that were a little more tough to deal with, but it did them in a good way without, going over the edge. So, and there were some very distinctive faith-based aspects of that film. That's where I think has been another big change in the faith-based film industry. Okay, we're still on the subject here of the naming of them. We're coming back around to that. Just bear with me. Okay, so we go down. It says, do faith-based movies really exist? So what do critics of faith-based films propose as a different definition of faith-based films? Many simply say we should do away with the label entirely. Christopher Williams falls into this camp. He said, Derek Webb once said it best, the word Christian, when applied to anything other than a person, is nothing more than a marketing term. There's no such thing as Christian music, movies, or literature. Faith-based films don't exist, friends of mine have said, echoing the sentiment, everyone has a faith, everyone has a worldview. Being a Christian means that you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. A movie can't do that. Therefore, a movie can't be Christian any more than you can have a Christian shoe or a Christian pizza. It's just a shoe. It's just a pizza. So again, there's all this, but really, what it comes back to is you got to have some way to classify. You got to have some way to name things or call things or refer to things. So all that's kind of a side point, really, but it comes back to, well, still, what are we going to call it so that people recognize it, identify with what it is, but have a good sense of what it actually is. And that's what this issue really is all about. So let's come down here. How should we define it? Let's get to the meat of the problem here. Given that the first definition of faith-based films is too narrow and the second is too broad, how should we define such movies? Author here says, I propose we define faith-based films as any film which affirms religious faith as one of its primary features. Goes on to say, this definition achieves the original intent of creating faith-based films to highlight and curate movies that represent and affirm the distinctive worldview and experiences of people of faith, while broadening it to include a wider variety of expressions of that, wherever they are found. This allows faith-based film to include movies like War Room, and I Can Only Imagine, but also movies like Signs, Les Miserables, and Calvary. These films may not have been made to be marketed specifically to devout moms, but they affirm and celebrate distinctly Christian worldviews. Okay, so that's interesting. It creates a very broad umbrella for anything religiously related about faith. So that works, but the problem is, of course, it's going to create all sorts of subcategories within that. So you're still not really getting a single term that will help you to identify Christian films as much as just reverting back to what it sounds like, faith-based films being an overarching umbrella for it. As it goes on to say, this definition then also creates an umbrella that allows us to have subcategories for further clarification. Since faith-based films now means both Christian and non-Christian faiths, Christian film is now a subcategory of faith-based film genre. Like I said, I don't know that that really resolves the problem, because we're looking for a way to have Christian films kind of classified and probably subcategories under that. So I don't know that I necessarily totally agree with this. It makes sense on one level, probably clarifies things. But for those in the Christian filmmaking industry, I don't know that it helps us a whole lot. It just kind of lumps a lot more into this category of faith-based films, which is being done already. Anyway, there will obviously continue to be debate as to which movies fall under the faith-based label, just as there is as to what makes someone truly Christian. I'm not entirely sure about that. But anyway, this definition also does come with its own somewhat hilarious implications for which movies now fall under the faith-based film label. And that's part of kind of the issue I'm talking about. Movies with distinctly pagan views of God and the afterlife, like Knock at the Cabin and The Northman, are just as much based on faith as Mom's Night Out and The Overcomer. Meanwhile, movies like Silence fall under a debatable category, depending on whether or not you think faith is ultimately affirmed or deconstructed. So that's the thing. What are we looking for here? Are we looking for, as I raised earlier, a name to classify Christian films that we can work with there? And how do you then define that? What goes into that category? Or are we really just looking for, as he's kind of suggesting, a big, broad umbrella for anything dealing with faith? That's the problem. And that's where we're still kind of wrestling with here. What really do we need? What does the industry need? And what are we looking for as Christian creatives as ways to help identify us or provide a proper classification for what our films are about? It goes on to say, so why does this matter? It matters because faith matters. Humans' relationship with God and the communities and worldviews that develop from that is a deeply important part of personhood. As people of faith, it is our job to create and curate a library of works that represent our faith, to witness to those who don't believe and to minister to those who do. We cannot do that effectively if we either limit too much or too little. Too much, and people can only see a sliver of God; too little, and they cannot see him at all. What does it matter if they are made by Hollywood or by the faith-based film industry? Like Paul said to the Philippians in Philippians 1:18, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. He goes on to say, likewise, I rejoice when non-Christian people of faith get to make works of art that celebrate how they see God, so that I can understand and therefore love them better the way that God has commanded me to. Interesting. There's some thoughts I could bring up there. I don't want to get into too much detail right now. But anyway, may those who make faith-based films and those who highlight them together help people see and love God and his creation. Okay, so there you go. Just kind of an interesting article that helps us enter into this whole discussion of what we call faith-based films or Christian films. I don't agree with everything in the article, but I think it does kind of open up the discussion a bit and offer some opportunity to examine things with the perspective that he presents and a little bit of background on some different things that all play into the discussion of what is a faith-based film. I'm not so sure that it cleared up much confusion on the issue. It may have created more, but it does offer some opportunities to really start thinking about this in a new and different way, and perhaps clarify some things at least a little bit as moving forward from here. I'm going to have more about this topic as we go on. I just thought this would be an interesting one to explore today. Take a look at this with this particular article as a way to enter into this discussion a bit. But what are your thoughts? Feel free to comment below. What do you think about faith-based films as a title, or should they be called Christian films or inspirational films or something else entirely different? Let me know your thoughts on all this. There's a lot here to unpack. Hopefully at least gave you something to think about today. Anyway, that's it for me today. Have a great day. God's blessings, and see you next time.